Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of SPME, and it is my pleasure to once again welcome you all to our webinar series. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to hear from our friend and colleague, Rabbi David Wolpe, who will talk to us about his year at Harvard. Rabbi Wolpe was the visiting scholar at the Harvard Divinity School and is currently the inaugural rabbinic fellow at the ADL. For the past the majority of his career, was the senior rabbi at Sinai Temple in LA and is currently the rabbi emeritus. Rabbi Wolpe is a prolific scholar and author on a variety of issues, dealing with religion in America and dealing with faith, and has a great deal to say about a lot of these issues. His sermons and his writings are highly recommended to all to read and to understanding the American Jewish community, and the questions really about faith and why all this matters in general. His experience at Harvard was very telling, given that he was there if I'm correctly, the hearings that were taking place on Capitol Hill with Harvard's now former president. But really, we were inviting him this afternoon to share his viewpoints about his experience and what he saw, and we'll take it from there. The format, those of you who've been with us in the past will remember, Rabbi Wolpe will talk for about 20-25 minutes, then we'll go into Q&A. If you have questions, please type them in via the chat, and we will do our best to get to them. If we do not, we apologize in advance, and feel free to email us after the webinar. But really, without further ado, Rabbi Wolpe, thank you for joining us, and
Thank you.
floor is now yours.
Thank you. Asaf, in the introduction, forgot to mention that we share a common origin, the cities of Philadelphia, but otherwise, a very generous and full introduction. And it's funny, like the title, My Year at Harvard, it makes me feel like, I'm about to give you my undergraduate resume, but I want to try to talk about, as you know, if you're on this call, you have heard endlessly about what happened at various college campuses. I wrote an article called My Year at Harvard, which you can find easily online. And a lot of the stuff that people talk about is so well known to us that I'm loath to try your patience by just repeating all the well-known anecdotes. And I'm going to try to hit a couple specific points that seem to me significant. And in that, of course, I'm eliding a great deal that went on. But I hope that that's going to be filled in both by your knowledge or by your assumptions, and that way we can use our time more productively. The first thing I want to say is I got to Harvard in September of 2023, and so basically about a month before October 7th. And I want to just tell you two things that made me aware. There were more than two. I mean, when I left my congregation in Los Angeles, people said to me basically, how are you going to survive at Harvard? It's not that Harvard didn't already have the reputation of being unsympathetic to Israel and or Jews, but nonetheless, when I got there, there were two things that I think are so symbolically important and almost frame the year that I want to mention them to you. The first was that a student came to my office and invited me to the only sukkah ceremony that was going to happen at Harvard Divinity School. The Divinity School sets up a kosher sukkah every year. I was in it a few times, and with the exception, I believe, of John Levinson, I was the only other person in the sukkah, but still, it was a kosher sukkah, which is a nice thing to do. And so I said, of course, I mean, I'm new to the Divinity School, I'm a rabbi, I'm going to go to the sukkah ceremony. When I went, I was somewhat disturbed that there was really no Hebrew content, no lulav, no etrog, no real explanation of Sukkot or what the sukkah symbolized. Instead, the entire ceremony involved, by the way, the explanation of, first of all, there were a couple of English songs, and then there was an explanation of Ushpizin, where you invite traditionally figures from Jewish history into the sukkah, except that instead of inviting Jewish figures, people said they left pieces of paper and invite in anyone you would like into the sukkah. And I think probably Maya Angelou got more invitations than Moses, but that's a separate question. But the way the ceremony was opened was as follows. The woman who would come to my office to invite me, who was a student, a graduating student, began the ceremony as follows. This is a safe space for anti-Zionists, non-Zionists, and those who are struggling with their Zionism. First of all, just the fact that it wasn't obviously a safe space for me. So for out-and-out Zionists, this is not a safe space. I'll put that aside, because I don't really think that was her intention. But the fact that she felt it important at a ceremony that had nothing to do with Israel or politics, to say you can be a non-Zionist here, was profoundly significant to me. And that a Jew opened the ceremony that way at Harvard was profoundly significant to me. And I think that there's so much in that is worth unpacking, but I will just make two observations about it. One is that, like attracts like. This generally, the Jewish students who are attracted to a place like HDS, Harvard Divinity School, will be those who are not what we would call mainstream Jewish students. And Harvard deeply encourages, sustains, nurtures, and supports that form of anti-Zionist Jew. And the second piece of this was that the woman who introduced the various classes to the students, I walked by her office and she had, this was all before October 7th, she had one poster on her office door which said democracy is not occupation in Hebrew, English, and Arabic. And again, I later found out that this woman who teaches Buddhism is actually in origin Jewish, again, unsurprisingly, sadly, but it let me know that the HDS stood for this. And in fact, later I found out that it really did stand for this when the most egregious single personality at HDS, whose name I won't mention, but if you email me, I'd be happy to tell you who it is, was interviewing a prospective student. And believe me when I tell you, this student had what my grandmother would call ala milas. She had all the virtues that you would want in a Harvard student. It was inconceivable to not accept this student, except that she had worked for Robert Kraft and his anti-Semitism project. And when the interviewer saw this on her resume, apropos of absolutely nothing, she said, "We wish you to know that here at HDS, we think of Israel as an occupying force." And then, by the way, of course, needless to say, the end of the story is the student was rejected. So the ethos was so powerful and prevalent that the things that happened subsequently, although shocking, were not surprising. And the fact that the non-Jewish progressive students, I don't even want to use the word progressive, might be too general. I'll just say the hard left anti-Zionist students, right? Because I think it is certainly possible to be a progressive and to be pro-Zionist. There is, in fact, an organization called Zionists that is specifically that. So let's say the hard left anti-Israel students were swimming in these waters where the Jews were, after all, supporting them. And so they knew that this was a function of decency, not of religious affiliation. And everything that happened subsequently, I think, has to be seen against that background. Important to note, by the way, that when we talk about the Jews who are anti-Zionist, we're not only talking about students. There's a range in the faculty, but some of the faculty members were right there with them. And the question in part is where the ideological roots of this lays, and I would at least advance a couple of theories about it, although there's no, I mean, in such things, you are always somewhat in the realm of speculation. The first thing that's important is that I think there has been, out of the polarization of mutual, like two magnets that repel each other, of mutual dislike on right and left, out of that, there's been a pushing to the extreme of each side. And the more you get patriotism from the right, the more you get critique of America from the left and vice versa. And this form of leftism, what you see on college campuses, is not just anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, it's deeply anti-Western. America, like Israel, is a colonial power. I mean, when students are praising the Houthi flag, which says literally on the flag, death to America, death to Israel, curse be the Jews, Allah is great, you know that this is a much broader ideological commitment than specifically the anti-Semitic commitment, which anti-Semitism almost always is. It rarely exists in a complete vacuum because, as you know, the Jews control the world, and therefore, if you're anti-Semitic, you also hate all the filaments that reach out where the Jews control everything else. And since we live in Zog, you may not be aware of this, a Zionist-controlled government, a Zionist organized government anyway, it's Zionist-controlled government, even though that is a creature of the right, in the horseshoe theory where the two come close to each other, Israel and America on the far left represent the same evil. So when these students were protesting, they were protesting deeply against everything that traditionally Harvard sort of stands for. And it's not possible to disentangle the anti-Semitism from all the other ideological affiliations that were noxious that these students advanced. So that's why I don't think anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are identical. Instead, I tell people that just the Venn diagram has a tremendous overlap. They have a lot of things in common, and it's not a mistaken assumption to assume that most people who are anti-Zionist have anti-Semitism as part of their DNA, but they're not exactly identical. And with the anti-Zionism goes a lot of other ideological affiliations too. But I thought, I mean, I'm supposed to tell you about my year at Harvard, and I've spent 15 minutes on ideology. Let me just give you one or two other incidents. The second piece of this is not just the hard ideology, it's also it's not that people as much exist in a bubble, it is much more that anyone outside that bubble is dismissed with contempt. By which I mean anybody that voted, for example, for Trump is a troglodyte and an idiot and probably a racist. And any ideology that does not prevail at Harvard is obviously and self-evidently mistaken. And there is a lot of that at Harvard, in part because there's a lot of cultural inbreeding. That is, people grow up in the same basic atmosphere and they go to the same places and they know the same people and they have the same cocktail party conversations. And that's, I think, why when I ended up on the anti-Semitism committee after October 7th, I've told the story many times. Claudine Gay, by the way, was deeply, deeply shaken by what had happened on October 7th and was really completely unprepared and asked me for books and how could she learn about Jewish history and about Israel and so on. It's not that she was, it's not that she thought that she knew, it was really that she thought this is completely outside my area. And yet, before she went to the hearing, when I offered to give her, like I said, take a quote from the Talmud or from the Bible or something that you can use at the hearing that will show that you've investigated it. No, not interested. Because the idea that Harvard would need anything outside of its normal ambit to represent itself was just, it didn't make any sense. It didn't compute. And I think for many people, the greatest shock was that, you know, a law firm coaching an Ivy League president ended up being so completely disastrous that it required a certain amount of rethinking about how our campuses have been operating. And you've seen, by the way, some unraveling of the DEI, which I'll get to in a second, and of Harvard has put out new rules about conduct and about time, place, and manner protests. And so you could not have the encampments again next year as you did last year, at least not according to the rules. Whether the rules will be enforced remains to be seen. There are two other ideological components I want to mention that I saw in play. DEI I'll get to last. It's the most familiar and you've heard about it 1,000 times. So let me go to something that you might not be as familiar with. My perception of my colleagues was that they were afraid of the students. And I think that they were afraid of the students because the students come in without a sense of reverence or a sense that I know less and should be taught. And I think that there are two reasons for that that are really important for people to understand. One is, this is a generation that has, because of transparency, social media, and so on and so forth, that has been exposed to all the depredations of the people who are supposed to be authority figures. So trust in every authority in American society, in world, probably in the world, but certainly in America, is much lower than it used to be. The police, politicians, clergy, judges, academics, experts, everything. I mean, look, there was a time Kennedy and Clinton did basically the same thing, except people hid what Kennedy did and people knew what Clinton did. Because as transparency grows, one of the things that happens is younger people get disillusioned because they don't have heroes, because all the heroes now have feet of clay. The second is that this is the first generation in human history, as far as I know, that has essential life skills that adults don't. They are born digitally, and most of them know how to work computers much better than their parents and certainly better than their grandparents. And the idea that an older generation has wisdom that they don't have seems counterintuitive when they know how the world works and we don't. And so when you get them in a classroom, I think that it is much harder to establish both the distance and also the authority that would lead students to take what their teachers say more seriously. And the power is with them. They're paying the bills and not with the faculty. And this is part of grade inflation and part of the fact that the students at Harvard for a little while there basically ran the show. I mean, don't have encampments, they had encampments. Don't protest in classrooms, and they protested in classrooms. And then the DEI, and I want to sort of close with this. The DEI piece is just to make it as clear as possible. I once wrote on what used to be Twitter and is now X that the only way you get an even lawn is with a lawnmower, right? Enough fertilizer won't do it. You give enough fertilizer, grass is going to grow unevenly. You have to cut down from above. And therefore, if you look for equality of outcome, if you assume that any unequal outcome is a product of discrimination, the only way to get equality of outcome is to cut down the grass. That's the only way. And guess who's the tall grass in this analogy? Not only, but certainly Jews. And so the unequal accomplishment of the Jewish people, which we have always seen as an object of pride. I mean, as a rabbi, do you know how many times I got emails telling me how many Nobel Prizes the Jews won? It was like every other day, someone would say, Rabbi, do you know how many Nobel Prizes the Jews have won? What we saw as pride was, in fact, evidence of structural inequalities that the Jews have taken advantage of because they're white. Never mind that the far right doesn't see us as white. Never mind that most of Israel are people of color. That's irrelevant. The experience of the people who feel this way is they look around them and Jews are running this and Jews are successful in that and Jews are doing well in this and the big donors are Jews and on. And therefore it must be, since it obviously can't be because I am less accomplished on my own, it must be that there is some kind of unfair advantage. And so DEI in its guts, in its core, in its DNA as currently constituted is anti-Semitic. It can't help but be anti-Semitic. It plays into all the stereotypes of the Jews nefariously running the world. And even though you did not necessarily hear that explicitly, you heard it implicitly over and over and over and over again, not only at Harvard, but certainly at Harvard. And so the upshot of all this is that it's really hard to combat anti-Semitism when what you're fighting is an ideology. It's not a group of people, it's an ideology. And until we have a significant shift, and there are people who are trying to do this, but until you have a significant shift on the left, in terms of college campuses, the ideology on the right is different and generally more fringe, less integrated with the prevailing political view. Until you have some shift that acknowledges that accomplishment is good and inherently unequal, we're going to have a real problem. I mean, we will have a problem anyway, because anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is the protean hatred. And that's the last thing to point out before we have questions, which is just something about the nature of anti-Semitism. There is a reason, an important reason, why you can hate Jews for being communists or capitalists or smart and accomplished, accomplished or poor and beggarly, or having a state and being strong, or being weak and pathetic and going like lambs to the slaughter, or I mean, on and on and on, for being too religious and wearing side curls and having long black coats, or for assimilating and looking like everybody else so you can't really tell who they are. I mean, you can hate Jews for whatever you hate. And that's because a lot of times anti-Semitism doesn't start with the Jew, it starts with the hate. That is, I hate the fact that my life is bad. Let me look for the culprit. And Jews make a very good culprit because they're big enough and significant enough to hate, but small enough to hate safely. Like, they're not going to destroy you because they're not significant. They're, I mean, a tiny percentage of the population, but they matter, and they create great coalitions. That's why you get queers for Hamas, because Jews are coalition builders. So it's going to be very difficult, as long as there is this hatred, to remove ourselves from the position of scapegoat in Ivy League colleges or anywhere else. I didn't mean to do this to discourage you, but we are in the 9 days. That is the saddest period of the Jewish calendar before Tisha B'Av, before the day of the destruction of the temple. And I will just remind you that the rabbi said that the destruction of the temple was because of sinat chinam, baseless hatred. And it was talking about of Jews for one another. If we build coalitions with our friends, and it's really important for Jews to recognize that we have a lot of friends in the world, a lot of friends, right and left. Jews are much, much better at identifying enemies than we are at embracing friends, that we actually can combat this very effectively. But we have to care for one another, and we have to care for people, even if they're not 100% with us in everything we agree about. People who are people of goodwill that want to stand beside the Jewish people. So I urge you to be wider and more embracing in terms of friendships, to encourage those who are good to us, and to seek less division inside and more unity towards the outside that is sometimes hostile. And with that, I've taken up, I think, more time than I thought I was going to. So let me stop and take questions or comments. I mean, I could talk about this for hours, but I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. 1 second. Spotlight. First of all, I mean, should not be minimized that the majority of our audience are involved with the academy and have been involved, and are academics and administrators. So, thank you for sharing, obviously, your firsthand accounts. And it should not be taken for granted, of course, that you stood up and shared about this, given what's happening in the academy, given the consequences. So, we all appreciate that. And of course, your words of wisdom during this time of year. There's a lot of questions, and you touched on a lot of high points. But I'll let Alex ask the first question, and then we'll go to the audience, and we'll take it from there.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks very much for a very important and I think a uniquely interesting picture into a sort of unique institution, Harvard Divinity School. And because I love talking about ideology, and whenever I do one of these webinars, I ramble on endlessly about ideology. I want to stick with that for just a minute. What you described is a situation where one part of Harvard, almost in a sense, a core, foundational part of Harvard, has inverted its traditional philo-Semitic orientation. The Congregationalists who created Harvard 450 or however many years ago were deeply versed in the Old Testament and the New Testament. They could read Hebrew better than most people. The Harvard commencement address was in Hebrew until relatively recently in that time frame. But Harvard Divinity School is in a sense an anachronistic institution. It has parallels at Graduate Theological Union Theological Seminary, Chandler School of Theology, or whatever it's called, at Emory, a couple other places here and there. And some of the questions have brought up or are asking, is your experience and your portrait of a deeply anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Western faculty and student body not counterbalanced to some extent by the reality of a gigantic Harvard Hillel and a very active Chabad and a Jewish student body? So what I'm wondering, again, to my question, do you think that your portrait is one of American academia or of American religious education and of American religion, or are these or is this really an outlier in a sense?
So there were better and worse. First of all, Harvard Divinity School has plenty of anti-Semitism in its history, as well as any Protestant institution would. Sure. So it's true that it has some philo-Semitism, but it wouldn't be hard to find anti-Semitism. And for a long time didn't admit Jews. And Harvard, by the way, has a history of anti-Semitism, and it had a Jewish problem way back in the 20s, and this is not new. Generally at Harvard, the bromide, the accepted wisdom is that the School of Public Health and the Divinity School are the two worst. But the Kennedy School has a lot of anti-Zionist and especially the Middle Eastern program, which is funded mostly by governments in the Middle East, is also pretty bad. Yes, there's a strong Jewish presence at Harvard, although less than there used to be. That is certainly true. And Hillel and Chabad were both thriving. And by the way, a lot of Jewish faculty who, I mean, I was on the faculty chat and so on, a lot of Jewish faculty, some of whom have always been strong supporters of Israel, some of whom woke up because of October 7th. Absolutely, no question about it. That also exists at Harvard. It's not a monochromatic picture. And by the way, don't forget that 33 student groups signed that letter after October 7th blaming Israel, and that a lot of faculty gave support to the students who were demonstrating, and a lot of faculty pressured people to withdraw the punishments, which were eventually done, and allow the students to graduate. So it's a very mixed picture. If I'm going to make one generalization, it would be this, which may not surprise any of you. The anti-Israel and ideologically left, far left, not left, but far left, contingents at Harvard are almost exclusively in the humanities. You don't find them in the engineering school. You don't find them as much in the hard sciences. When you look down the list of the professors who've signed these anti-Israel Jeremiads and screeds, they're generally from anthropology, English, sociology, so on and so forth. There are, however, the exception to this seems to be the medical schools. I spoke at BU's medical school because they were having terrible problems there, and it's not the only place. So it is, I agree, a very complicated picture. And even at HDS, there are a couple of professors who expressed their sympathies in various ways, although I have to say, after October 7th, not a single professor reached out to me that I'm aware of, and never did, with one semi-exception in the course of the year. So I don't know. I still think that my picture is not, it may be a little skewed, but not too skewed.
Great.
Well, I would absolutely agree with you. I'm just trying to.
No, it's an important challenge to meet and to think about. And by the way, if you want to see the other side of this put very well, you can read the latest Harvard Crimson article by Shaul Magi that appeared yesterday and the day before. That is, and I wrote to him and I said, look, I don't agree with you. I think that you're actually a better example of an open-minded professor than most, even though, I mean, Shaul and I have vast ideological disagreements, but he's the kind of person who you could say anything in his class and he will engage you as opposed to insult you. But if you want to see the other side, you can read his piece.
I have it up on my screen here, and I was going to bring it up later, but maybe let's give other people a chance with questions before I do my own Jeremiads.
We'll go. Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. So there are a bunch of questions. Let me try to combine them and try to collate some of these issues here. So one question by Lauren Schreiber is asking, and obviously, you're talking about the negative part. He's curious about Jewish life on campus as far as Chabad, Hillel, and as far as life itself. If you could comment about that. And I would also add, if there have been a few questions about the impending lawsuit by the student by Shabbos Kessenbaum. And so, any comments you want to, make on that, as well as, is that helping or not helping? I mean, and I would just add, just to kind of expand on that, the environment post, you were there before Gay resigned, as far as like the environment itself, are things, are these cosmetic changes, or are these like actual things that are happening? And that, of course, relate to some of the questions that are coming up now. How does all this relate to what we're going to see in the fall? So just a few
So
points.
this is a really, really good question, to which I'm not sure I have a really, really good answer. I think that it is, I don't know how many of you know Alan Garber, who is the new president, he was just named president. Alan is, first of all, a serious Jew. He has a brother who lives in Israel. He brings, I think, he brings a double sensibility to this. He wants everything. I mean, he's a peacemaker in both the good and bad sense of that word. That is, sometimes when you're a peacemaker, you make compromises that you don't if you're more combative. But the reason Harvard is coming out, I think, with new rules and so on is not only because of the absolute catastrophe of the past year, but because Alan really does believe that these things should be more enforced. What I don't know, and what I think, if the stakes weren't so high, I would say will be interesting to see. It's how I feel about American political life. If I had absolutely no stake, it would be really fascinating just to watch what's going on in American politics. Unfortunately, every day I wake up just upset on both sides. But I actually don't, I should like, let me just, a quick caveat, just for those of you who are watching. I don't so much wake up upset on both sides, because I encourage you to live your life locally and not on screens. Like, don't allow political things to upset you. When you and I both know that really what happens with your friends, your family, yourself, your health, those are the things that matter most to your life. So don't allow yourself to be artificially put into depression by the fact that the world is so messed up. You can look at that, try to fix it to the extent that you can, but not allow it to dominate your life. That's my little rabbinic homily for the day. I don't know when all of this starts up again, whether Alan and whoever is part of his administration will be able to contain it. Because one of the things that I gleaned, I don't know this firsthand, but that I gleaned is that the rot began with the corporation, not with the administration. I mean, the Harvard is run by this, shadowy group. The corporation comes right out of John Grisham. The only time, by the way, they ever communicated with us, the anti-Semitism group, and I don't know whether all of you know this, but it's now public, so I'm free to say it, is a few weeks before the congressional testimony and before I resigned, 5 or 6 of the members of the anti-Semitism committee said, look, we've had enough. Nobody's doing anything. We're all going to, and we wrote a letter saying we're all going to resign. And magically, Penny Pritzker showed up at our next meeting. And she's the chair of the corporation. And she said, we're about to change. Claudine has a plan, and so on and so forth, and give us time. And so we said, okay, fair enough, we will give you time. But other than that, the corporation did nothing. So I hope that this will have taught them a lesson, but I wouldn't guarantee it. I just hope so.
Great. By the way, talking, this, popped up on my Twitter, former X, that that the judge ruled against Harvard in the Kestenbaum case, that is just coming out now, which is obviously also
I
quite
didn't know. Really, that
Yeah.
just happened.
That just happened minutes as we, hot off the press.
What does that mean?
Well, Alex,
The case goes forward.
The case goes forward, basically.
Okay.
I mean, it's going to allow him to go forward and the investigation, and obviously and more to the point, discovery, which is obviously I guess can you prove all of this? So one point from one of our colleagues, I'm sure our colleague Ira Sheskin, who teaches Jewish studies at University of Miami. is asking, he's pointing out that there are 4,000 degree granting institutions. These are relatively small, things that have happened. And obviously he's saying that Miami obviously did not, was not as impacted. Obviously there are a lot of institutions, but going back to, Alex's early point, why Harvard? I mean, what's the, why has Harvard become, such a toxic place, within the history of Harvard?
I have an answer for that. I have two answers to that. The first answer to that is what Larry Summers, who was, by the way, wonderful through this, really like a tremendous chizuk, a tremendous encouragement to the anti-Semitism committee, to the cause of fighting for this, for the Jewish students and so on. He was great. But one of the things that he said to us is, he said, Harvard is the most important NGO in the world. And he may or may not be right, but it's certainly up there. And so this is something that Larry Bacow, the former president of Harvard, said to me over dinner when I first came. He said, when we know, this again was before October 7th, he said, we know if you put Harvard in a tweet or a post, that you will get 20% more response, just automatically because it says Harvard. And so that means that whatever problem or disaffection or disease there is in the body politic, it's going to show in extreme form in this place because it is so important and so influential. People who go there are going to try to, someone once said to me, for example, anybody who leads a protest at Harvard, their career is made. All they have to do is put on the resume, I was the one who created the encampments. And the world that is sympathetic ideologically to the encampments will say, oh, we want this guy. So it immediately it puts into warp speed, to go back to old Star Trek, it puts into warp speed anything that is already happening. That's one reason. And then the second reason is that the old French deconstructionist, everything is relative theory that infected academia, infected elite academia. It's like it didn't have as much of an influence on third or fourth tier schools as it did on Stanford, Berkeley. I mean, just listen to the places: Stanford, Berkeley, Harvard, Yale, with the exception of University of Chicago, probably because it's the middle of the country, but maybe for other reasons too. But all of these places got really radicalized because that was the vanguard of theory. And you always want to be in the vanguard of theory. So I think that's the other reason that it's true. And then I would lastly say the old Protestant heritage has in its DNA anti-Semitism. It just does. And if we think that that doesn't still exist, then you don't know enough Christians. Because even though the revolution in the Christian attitude towards Judaism has been one of the great miracles of the last 50, 60, 75 years, and God knows we have many, many, many friends in the Christian community, and I'm enormously grateful for that, they have to overcome something in their own tradition to get there. And a lot of people don't.
Thank you for that. One point that comes to mind, and Alex and I have spoken about this, early on before you were there, but when the Crimson came out, when the editors, all the former editors got the letter signing on to supporting of BDS, obviously what, the point that, what was interesting about that was basically a kind of a lens into the future elite and leadership of American, and where all of this is going and what it really constitutes to be part of the rank and file membership. Right. People like yourself and Larry Summers and others, and all stood up for this, and against it, given, where, what Harvard should be like and what it stands for. Some of the questions that were coming up, and is, really, your perception, was that really, your interaction with students, Jews and non-Jews, were they open to listening to any other viewpoints, or was the echo chamber so ideological and so religious to put it into religious
Right.
terms, that even a rabbi or, would not,
No.
sway them, to move beyond their belief system.
I had this experience with, at one of the Harvard Divinity School dinners, I sat with 3 Arab students and we talked mostly about the politics of Pakistan. And then at the end, I said, look, I want to talk to you guys. I want to hear what you have to say. I want to be able to. And they said, oh, yes, we want to. Give us your number. I gave them my number. I gave them my email. I never heard from them. And when I asked somebody in the same camp, at the encampments, actually, I said, I spoke to these guys. I never heard from them. He said, of course, we can't talk to you because it's a betrayal. It's like you're talking to the enemy. And I think that was really, that's why friendships broke up on campus. And friendships did break up on campus, not because people couldn't put politics aside, but because their own group would see them talk to somebody who was associated with the other group. And it's your own group that makes you an extremist. It's not the other side. So it was really hard. And I would say, did I have conversations with people who are anti-Zion? Absolutely. But the ones that I did were almost the ones that were less, just by definition. They were not chanting at the encampments as much. My attempts to talk to people at the encampments were mostly not successful.
Great, thank you for that. One question that our friend David Hershenson is asking, going back to your points about Garber, what do you think that thoughts about what he should be doing to start off the fall, in a safe way, given the toxic environment that we're in politically all around, but are there any kind of pointers or ideas that you would have that how to start off the year right?
I would suggest 2 things, as broad categories. One is make really clear, not just publish them, but make clear at an opening talk to the entering class or to the whole class, make very clear, this protest is permitted, this protest is not permitted. And say what the punishments will be if somebody tries that protest, and make it exquisitely clear so that there's no question. One of the problems at Harvard, as some of you who are on the call know, is that Harvard is a balkanized university. So I remember asking Claudine Gay, if you commit the same crime, whatever the crime is, in the law school and the School of Government and the School of Fine Arts, do you get 3 different punishments? And she said, yes. And that's a problem, right? So you got to get all the deans on board and say, and I think that's probably part of the work that Garber's trying to do. You have to get all the deans on board and say, if someone does this, this is the punishment. And that's ideally, that would be the first thing. And then the second is, I wanted it when I was there, moderated conversations between different points of view. Students and faculty, have a faculty member moderate different points of view between students so that people see that you can. The one who did this was Tarek Massoud, who did this in the Kennedy School, and it was brilliant. He had Jared Kushner and he also had Salam Fayyad. And people on each side were furious with him. He had someone on the other side, but that's the point of being at a university. So I think if they had a series of moderated conversations by skilled faculty, and they certainly have the faculty to do it, that would be a really helpful thing to take some of the poison out of the discourse.
Great, thank you. Parenthetically, by the way, apropos consequences, as we know that, part of why the successes took place at Columbia was because in the spring, students already know there would be no consequences. They already got pass-fail as an option. And so right. They were reacting, the consequences were they were not there. So there was basically, that they had a safety net, as far as their actions all around, which again, yes. Something to think about as well administratively. Alex, I know you have a question. I wanted to go back to you.
Sure. It's very interesting that you mentioned Larry Summers' statement about Harvard being the world's most important NGO, and that I think is an extremely telling statement, because that is it's an NGO and an NGO training academy for to accredit future global elites.
Right.
Yeah. And that is, I looked it up while you're speaking. Harvard's undergraduate, at least, population is 26.8% foreign. Columbia's, I believe, is 55% foreign. So these are international brands.
Yes.
That have global reach to the furthest corners of the earth, and in terms of demand and supply. So has the brand been damaged?
Badly.
And is a university about a brand?
In part, not all universities the same, but I mean, anything that's trying to attract customers has to be in part about a brand. I think Harvard stock went down a lot. Having said that, that doesn't mean that they're not still going to get thousands more applicants than they can accept. They will, because we're talking about a hit that was taken by a university of tremendous standing. But I think what happens this coming year will be very important in how people end up evaluating it. But I know people who would have applied to Harvard who didn't. But that may be from a fairly narrow community. I don't know.
Well, certainly there is a Jewish migration away from the Ivy League.
Yes,
that is.
But most of the students were there. They were there just to, to finish their classes and get a job. I mean, this was not the majority of the students that were involved in this protest. And so I don't know. I think that it certainly took a tremendous hit, but whether that will be lasting remains to be seen.
Should it take a hit? Should society hold Harvard and other elite institutions to some other standard, because they do provide such an overwhelming proportion of the elite class, the managerial class of NGOs and governments and corporations and so on.
I'm not sure how society holds something to a standard
through a market.
But to the extent that it can be held to a standard in terms of the press that it got, the comments that were made. I mean, look, whatever Claudine Gay did, right or wrong, for, I don't know, 6 months, 8 months, she was, I can't think of somebody who was more vilified in the United States since Harvey Weinstein. She took, I mean, enormous, almost unprecedented abuse, this one woman, for something that was not, I mean, that was much bigger than what she had done or didn't do, that involved lots of universities and lots of ideologies and lots of students and lots of faculty and lots of other things. So, yeah, I mean, society does hold these institutions to account. I think that none of them, not Harvard, not Columbia, not Berkeley, none of them emerged from this quite the way they went into it. But how lasting that will be, I don't know.
At the risk of seeming cynical, I for one, did not plagiarize portions of my doctoral dissertation.
Yeah, but no, at the risk of seeming defensive, lots of people did that without becoming public enemy #1, having their picture all over the world.
Sure.
Terrible constantly, saying that someone did something wrong and saying that they received more abuse than anyone else in the world for months. Those are two different things. And she did. And I think that's,
But isn't there a salutary dimension to that, to expose the mediocrity that is at the core of many of these
I'm talking a degree of, maybe you didn't follow the degree of vilification the way I did. No, I think that it was way overboard, way overboard. I think that you could have deposed her. She was clearly had resigned basically in disgrace without constantly having articles all over the world about how horrible she was. It served, look, it also served political purposes. And as soon as you get enmeshed right or left in politics in this world, it gets very, very ugly. This wasn't only about, let's give a salutary lesson to people that you shouldn't plagiarize. This got much bigger than that, I think.
To that end, I mean,
it's interesting that you bring in left and right into this, because on a hard quantifiable basis measured by, let's say, donations to political parties, universities are almost unanimously on the political left.
Of course, but I didn't say right in terms of giving money to universities. I said right in terms of the vilification of Claudine Gay. I'm talking about the way she was treated in the press on the right. That has nothing to do with universities. Yes, universities are leftist institutions. That's part of the reason. I mean, why do you think the Republican committee again and again and again said, I defer to Representative Stefanik? It clearly had, for all that it was just or not just, it also had a political dimension. You can't remove that from everything that happens in American public life.
But can the problem be solved without politics? I mean, are these institutions self-regulating in some way?
Alex, I'm not saying that you should remove politics. I'm saying that it's inevitable to have it. I think that you're getting defensive about the right in a way that I don't think is necessary. All I'm saying is that she was vilified in the press in general, and especially vilified in the right-wing press in a way that was not about, let's actually understand from this. It was about the fact that everything in America has a political valence, which is true. And that's true on the left and on the right. As soon as there's somebody on the other side that does something, you listen to how the left speaks about, obviously Trump, but look at Vance lately. And here's something that's clearly untrue about him, that everyone knows is untrue, about the couch that became a universal meme. It's very, very ugly. And once you get caught in that maw, either way, it's not a pretty sight. And that's part of what happened to Harvard here. And I'm not at the moment making a point about right or left. I'm saying once you get into the politics of things, you get chewed up in a way that has nothing to do with the original crime.
But are universities self-regulating?
Well, they should be, but are they? I think it's really hard for any big institution to be self-regulating, whether businesses or universities. It's why we have government. But
so how then are they to be held account? Simply through markets or through the political economy that provides them with billions of dollars?
Yeah, and government regulation is part of it, and there are government regulations, and the marketplace and students. But the truth is that there's a real conflict here that's very hard to solve between being hands-off so that a university can do research that could be controversial or difficult or say things that people don't like or so on, and also holding them accountable so that they do the kind of work that they should do. And I mean, people have been grappling with this for a long time. I'm not sure that I have the right answer, but it's a difficult one. And it's 9:59. Well, here on the West Coast. So
we're not going to solve this problem
today.
Not
this time. Next time we're going to solve it, though. You'll see.
Alex
and I will exchange some emails, and next time we'll have it done.
We'll have it all.
I'm on it.
All right, well,
anyway.
Really, Rabbi Wolpe, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you
for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. There's obviously a lot more to discuss, and so we hope you can join us again. But
I do. I would like that. I'd like that because we left a lot still on the table, and there's a lot to talk about. So
there's a lot to talk about, a lot more questions, and so we apologize again for those we didn't get to all your questions. And I want to thank my colleague Alex Shafi, as always, for joining me. You, the audience, for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on what coast you're on. And above all, to you, Rabbi Wolpe, for joining us. And we'll be in touch.
Great. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.